Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, bienvenue, welcome to our celebration of International Human Rights Day, leaving no one behind, an intersectional approach to fulfilling sexual and reproductive health and rights for all women and girls. My name is Kasia Madeira, and I am so thrilled to be here with you all today, moderating today's extremely prestigious event. We have so many fantastic guests with us today. Now, I'm a television anchor at BBC World News. We're the international channel on the BBC News platform with around 123 million viewers worldwide, incredible reach, and it's a very privileged job which I've been doing with BBC News for around 20 years. So thank you very much for inviting me to be with you today. Now, before we start, and I will get on with it, I do promise, please let me go through some housekeeping matters. Now, on your screens, there will be a housekeeping slide so that everyone can find the interpretation button as quickly as possible. Anyone experiencing any technical issues or who cannot find the interpretation button, don't worry, don't panic. Please just message in the chat and the fantastic and supportive IPPF support team will message you directly. So you're not alone, don't worry. Also, just to let you know, get your thinking caps on, because towards the end of the panel discussion, we will have a questions and answers session. So please get your thinking hats on, share your questions using the chat function, and we will endeavour to respond to your questions after the panel discussion of our meeting. Then if there are any unanswered questions, so I'm expecting a lot, keep them coming, we'll aim to respond to them in a frequently asked questions follow-up note. So please do message us. We want this to be interactive. So let's begin. This is a real honour for me to be with you today. We must start the event by thanking warmly the governments of Tunisia and Canada, and of course the IPPF team for organising such an important and such a timely event. The issues we're discussing are of the most importance in our world today. Human rights, including sexual and reproductive rights, and the principles of non-discrimination and fundamental freedoms are as critical as ever for the present and for the future, for individuals, for families, and for the future world that the children, and girls in particular, will inherit. So on that note, I would like to give the floor, the virtual floor, to His Excellency Ambassador Adel Ben Laka, Deputy Permanent Representative of Tunisia, for some remarks on behalf of his government.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the floor. Excellencies, dear colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to join you in this event. And let me start by expressing my deep appreciation to the Government of Canada and to the International Planned Parenthood Federation for the organization of this meeting. The choice of such a topic on the occasion of the International Human Rights Day is timely, especially that sexual and reproductive health and rights of all women and girls are unfortunately often not given due consideration as fully fledged human rights. We have undoubtedly achieved important strides towards gender equality and the fulfillment of sexual and reproductive health and rights. This year's commemoration of the 27th anniversary of the United Nations and the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action and the 20th anniversary of the Resolution 1325 on Women in Peace and Security stand as important reminders of progress made on issues of human rights and gender equality so far. However, time after time, we come to find out that these achievements are still fragile and that SRHR are disregarded and challenged, especially in times of crisis or emergency. And we have times of emergency and crisis nowadays. The global COVID-19 pandemic is a live testimony to that, as its impact continues to be felt worldwide. We have witnessed the quick shift of the national and the international focus towards combating the pandemic, which unfortunately put a tremendous pressure on the resources pertaining to gender and the SRHR issues. Furthermore, member states have taken strict measures to prevent infections, which had many unintended consequences on women and girls by either denying them access to life-saving services or by providing poor quality services. At the same time, the lockdown of millions of women and girls inside their homes has exposed them to increasing risks of domestic violence, harmful practices, and interruption of education and awareness-raising programs. The impact of the pandemic has been disproportionately negative, especially on vulnerable women and girls suffering from multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. Dear colleagues, violations of women and girls' sexual and reproductive health and rights are often deeply rooted in patriarchal norms and negative social perceptions pertaining to women's sexuality and their place within the family and the society. A debate of intersectionality is extremely important in this framework. Gender equality cannot be fully achieved unless we recognize that women and girls are not homogeneous groups, that they face a wide range of different obstacles and forms of discrimination, and that they require adequate response measures tailored to their different needs and contexts. Therefore, it is essential that all these factors are taken into account for gender equality and human rights to become inclusive and all-encompassing. This should start by rethinking our presumptions, combating patriarchal and negative social norms, strengthening data disaggregation and mainstreaming a gender-sensitive approach throughout our programs and policies. I would like to conclude by underscoring the importance of feminist and grassroots movements in raising awareness and advocating for inclusive gender equality. Tunisia recognizes the challenges imposed on civil society organizations in the face of the pandemic, which adds to other challenges caused by an already shrinking civic space. We remain very committed to work together with all stakeholders to achieve gender equality and inclusive enjoyment of SRHR by all women and girls. I thank you, and I look forward to our discussion today. Thank you. The floor is back to you.
And we thank you so warmly, His Excellency Ambassador Adel Ben-Lacha, Deputy Permanent Representative of Tunisia, inspiring words. And also thank you for the commitment of the Tunisian government to gender equality, women and girls' rights, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and for ensuring that no one is left behind. Now it is my great pleasure to invite Karina Gould, Minister of International Development of Canada, as our keynote speaker to give us a brief presentation of Canada's feminist foreign policy and progressive stand on gender equality. The Minister is passionate about breaking down barriers for women, youth and underrepresented groups. Minister Gould, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Kazia, and thank you to IPPF for hosting, and a very special thank you to the Republic of Tunisia for co-sponsoring this event with Canada. I was very pleased to join you and also to hear those wonderful opening remarks from the Deputy Permanent Representative. So thank you very much for that. And good morning from Ottawa in Canada. I am very pleased to join you here today. This is a topic that is very close to my heart. We are meeting on a significant day for such an important discussion. International Human Rights Day gives us the chance to reflect on our fundamental rights and freedoms. We know there's been a lot of progress since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. But events of 2020 have reminded us that there is still a long way to go. And today is also significant because it is the final day of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. The campaign reminds us that all women's rights are human rights and that gender-based violence is a violation of human rights. In Canada, a recent report found that human rights violations and abuses are the root cause of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit or LGBTQI people. Despite our progressive social and legal environment, Canadians from coast to coast to coast also continue to confront major obstacles to comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and rights. For example, our small province of Prince Edward Island doesn't have an abortion clinic, meaning women have to travel to another province for treatment. Access is a major challenge for many who live in rural or remote communities all across Canada. A stressful, costly situation, all too familiar for many around the world. And when medical abortion was legalized in Canada, doctors didn't know how to prescribe the pills and often didn't want to, blocking access for those who should legally have been entitled to have it within their reach. It took advocacy, activism, and education for doctors to provide appropriate access. Advocates also fought long and hard for access to birth control. At one point, it was illegal to distribute birth control information, much less birth control itself. Pioneers like Dr. Elizabeth Bagshaw and Dorothy Palmer defied laws that criminalized its distribution. They paved the way for birth control to be legalized in my country in the 1960s. In the same decade, a handful of Canadians, tired of reading stories of pharmacists charged for selling condoms, organized, lobbied, and educated Canadians until they were able to found the first Planned Parenthood organization in Canada. Now, the International Planned Parenthood Federation is at the forefront of programming and advocacy work that brings together stakeholders from around the world and strives to create spaces so that the international community can hear from the voices of all. The realization of sexual and reproductive health and rights around the world is a necessary step in helping all women everywhere realize their rights. We can support women's economic empowerment, but it won't be enough if women aren't actually participating in the economy because they don't have control over their reproductive options or can't access childcare. That includes access to safe and legal abortion, as well as comprehensive sexuality education. I am able to be Canada's Minister of International Development as a result of pioneers in Canada who fought for women to have access to birth control and the bodily autonomy and opportunities for economic empowerment that followed from this. I am able to choose if I want to have children, when I have children, how many children I have, and who I have children with. But too many women still do not have control over these choices. They have the right to these choices, but the obstacles they face can seem insurmountable. We know women in all their diversity should be able to fully realize the right to dignity, the right to information, and the right to support. But around the world, COVID-19 mitigation measures, especially stay-at-home orders, are contributing to increased domestic and intimate partner violence and disrupting essential services, including SRHR ones. We are all committed to doing whatever it takes to prevent decades of gains being rolled back by the pandemic. So what do? We cannot allow deeper poverty, rising inequalities, entrenched discrimination. That's why Canada is redoubling our commitment to using a feminist approach to addressing this pandemic. Implementing an intersectional feminist approach has entailed a continued, significant, and deliberate shift in Canada's international assistance processes and practices. We put the issue of gender equality at the center of Canada's thinking by committing 15% of our development assistance to projects that are focused on advancing equality. However, it isn't just about gender equality. Of course, that's an important part, but it goes beyond. Our feminist approach means that we must identify, address, and transform power dynamics. For me, that means taking an intersectional approach, both in what we do and how we do it. And it means acknowledging and deliberately addressing how race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, religion, and other factors all combine to determine how a person experiences marginalization, discrimination, or oppression. The comprehensive sexuality education, which Canada funds with IPPF, provides an excellent example of how an intersectional lens can take a development intervention from good to transformational. Intersectional CSE doesn't just talk about sexuality, it incorporates the society it's connected to, including gender, race, class, ability, and religion. For example, a curriculum that lacks intersectionality may discuss the risks of pregnancy and the dangers of sexually transmitted infections, but does not explain how Indigenous youth in particular may be disproportionately impacted by sexual harassment, STIs, and unintended pregnancy. Practically, as international and local actors and funders, we need to realize that we will only be able to find the best solutions by listening, critically assessing our own attitudes and activities, recognizing that we don't know everything, and approaching local communities as equals and collaborators. We must demand this reflection in our work and actions so that we do not reinforce discriminatory structures and power dynamics. Because by explicitly confronting the barriers that have reinforced systems of inequality, we have the chance to work together to identify new ways to overcome them, allowing individuals to improve their own lives and those of their families, communities, and countries. But change does not happen overnight, and the biggest changes take the most work. One of the many things I have witnessed during the COVID-19 crisis is that governments will take unprecedented action when faced by a crisis. We have seen changes that the SRHR community has been calling on for years take place overnight, which are steps towards putting the control of their bodies back into women's hands. This includes widening access to information and referrals through telehealth services, providing increased access to medical abortion pills, and increasing supplies of antiretrovirals from 1 to 3 months for those living with HIV/AIDS. We must keep up this momentum. More than ever, through funding, advocacy, and policy work, we must work together to reinforce and protect SRHR, including access to safe abortion and contraception. We must not be thwarted by opposition or lose focus because of all the other immediate pressures created by the pandemic that also require our attention. When we look back, we need to be able to say that we stood up and did everything we could to raise up the voices of the most vulnerable. I am so proud of Canada's 50+ years of collaboration with Planned Parenthood advocates. I look forward to hearing from some of these leaders who are on this panel today and to the continued collaboration between Canada and IPPF in the future. I want to thank all of you for attending and for the bravery you show every day for showing up for your community and speaking what are often uncomfortable or unwelcome truths to the power structures around you. On this International Human Rights Day, I call on all countries to shape their development assistance programming and social development programs with a feminist and human rights lens. Because targeting those who experience oppression and discrimination ensures that the largest societal changes take place. I cast my mind back to the proclamation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That promise that freedom, justice, and peace would be the foundation of our world is still our aspiration. That promise that everyone was born with equal and inalienable rights as part of the human family is at the core of Canada's feminist-based foreign policy. And that promise was to leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Gould, for that inspiring overview of the Canadian feminist foreign policy. We hope that more countries will follow through and feminist foreign policy will be the rule and not the exception. I'm sorry to jump in, but we had some technical problems with our moderator. She will come back. Thank you again, Minister. And I would like now to move a little bit south in the American continent. It is a pleasure to introduce you to Alexis McGill Johnson, President and CEO of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, and also, most importantly, a renowned social and racial justice leader, a lifelong political and cultural organizer. Alexis, as a leader, a woman, an activist, a person of color living in one of the most developed and industrialized countries in the world, how does your work address the root causes of pervasive patriarchal norms and structural discrimination towards women and girls, in particular those belonging to minorities? How are policies such as the gag rule rooted in those norms? And what are the consequences for women and girls' rights and needs? And how do you see the future of for the next generation? How are the intersection of movements like the reproductive justice and the Black Lives Matter affecting thinking and perspectives about the future of feminism and human rights for all? I know that this is probably a lot of questions, but we would like to take this opportunity to hear you on such a vast number of things that we would like to know more and learn from your experience. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Karina. It's so wonderful to be with you. And Minister Gould, I mean, I kept imagining as you were speaking, what if our cabinet officials had the clarity and the fluency that you bring to talking about matters of sexual and reproductive health, your remarks, your leadership on the world stage, it just, thinking about how Canada really does give them such a strong model for the world through its feminist foreign policy. So I thank you for that. At Planned Parenthood, we have helped develop a vision for what a U.S. feminist foreign policy could and should look like. And we'd love to see our government take a page from your innovative approach to advancing gender equity. I'm really honored to be here with so many international thought leaders to affirm our shared commitment to intersectional public policy. As we enter a new chapter for the United States under the Biden-Harris administration, we have an opportunity to work together and to strengthen diplomacy and public health around the world. We all recognize that the impact of US policy does not stop at our borders, and it's not enough to restore the status quo of the past 4 years. We have to reimagine sexual and reproductive health as a core part of personal freedom, not as a siloed issue or a woman's issue. Planned Parenthood was founded on the belief that our bodies are our own, and without that premise, we can never truly be free. Today, Planned Parenthood health centers live out our mission by providing birth control, STD testing and treatment, affirming identity care, and safe and legal abortion, literally providing the tools for imagining freedom. We're proud to be a founding member of the International Planned Parenthood Federation, which has a presence in 164 countries worldwide. And as Planned Parenthood Global, we work with over 100 local partners in Africa and Latin America to expand access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. Over the last 4 years, our partners have reached over 6 million patients, a majority of whom are young people. We know that by providing healthcare, we can serve as a bridge to healthy lives and freedom. That's why Planned Parenthood stands against US foreign policy that undermines the ability to advance health, human rights, and gender equality. As the United States prepares for our leadership transition, Planned Parenthood is calling on the Biden administration to permanently end the global gag rule. It has disrupted access to healthcare in countries around the world. It has silenced advocates working to expand abortion access in their own countries. Politicians in the US should not be able to deny anyone access to health services. And the consequences for women and girls limit their freedom to make decisions about their own bodies and future, and reinforce colonial and patriarchal norms that we're all working so hard to dismantle. We're also calling on President-elect Biden to rescind the global gag rule in his first days in office. But what we really need is a permanent repeal of the global gag rule, which can only be done by congressional action. In working with Congress to pass the Global HER Act, the Biden administration would signal to the world that for the US, access to reproductive health and rights is a human right that we will continue to protect now and in the future. It's a critical part of the Biden administration meeting its own call to build back better. This year, the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and our long overdue racial reckoning in the US gave us a strong and stark reminder that there cannot be any health equity without gender and race equity. Across the United States and around the world, people are standing against systemic racism and discrimination and demanding more. And at the end of the day, this is one fight. It is a fight for our human rights. If we want to reduce disparities, we have to understand that people live at the intersection of injustices. They could face discrimination because of their gender identity, or police violence because of the color of their skin. They could be facing issues related to having a low income or living in a community or country where resources are out of reach. They could face barriers in sexual and reproductive rights and health because of their education or their migration status. The scars of colonialism could further complicate their ability to access care. All of these elements have an impact on a person and on each other. When we see a person's whole intersectional self and the ways that elements of their identity overlap in messy and sometimes hierarchical ways, we're better equipped to address the barriers they might face. Planned Parenthood is a critical part of the public health infrastructure, and our lens is through our patients. That means we have an opportunity and an obligation to think differently about health equity. We commit ourselves and call on others to help amplify nationally led movements fighting for racial equity. We encourage all IPPF members, especially those based in Europe and the Americas, to join us in doing the internal work to dismantle racial hierarchy that undergirds white supremacy. We need to tear down the silos that keep movements and allies apart and recognize that our collective liberation is bound up together. The pandemic has accelerated this paradigm shift. Young activists from across the globe and movements are asking existential questions about what's possible. The opportunity of this moment is so exciting. We can actually rewrite the future, not just of reproductive rights, but of freedom as we know it. COVID-19 has laid bare the importance of international cooperation. We certainly have our work cut out for us, but we also have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to get this right. So let's make what we once thought was impossible inevitable. Thank you.
Alexis, it's so moving to hear you. It's so frustrating that these acts and these norms are so embedded in our societies and our lives, no matter where we are, where we live. But hearing you give that optimism and making us get together and use that opportunity is just absolutely fantastic. You're giving us hope and really inspiring us all to brighter times ahead. Thank you. Now, I know that Minister Gould is incredibly interested in your work and she would like to ask you a question. So, Minister, I offer you the virtual floor.
Thank you, Kasia. And thank you, Alexis, so much for those powerful remarks. And, in Canada, we're also, facing this reckoning of racial injustice as well, and certainly within our government, but also within international development, trying to understand and ensure that we can confront these systemic issues in a meaningful way. And so when it comes to SRHR, when it comes to breaking down these barriers of towards inequality, what can like-minded governments do to keep advancing this agenda?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I think that our allies, particularly after the last 4 years, our allies have to make clear to the Biden administration that U.S. leadership on sexual and reproductive health and rights is an essential component of U.S. re-engagement in the global community. And holding that as a barrier in conjunction with over 90 organizations, Planned Parenthood Federation of America publicly released we call our blueprint for sexual and reproductive rights, health and justice. And it is a detailed and bold, proactive domestic and foreign policy agenda for a fully supportive Congress and administration. It's really helpful when you have a roadmap, right? Both for kind of how the sets of harmful policies that have taken place, what needs to happen to undo them, but also the opportunities to make progress. I think that's where my hope stems from, knowing that we actually do have a concrete set of actions that really make it possible for us to rejoin the global community in the fight for sexual and reproductive health and rights for all, and be a true partner, as opposed to the impact that we've had. I also mentioned our calls to repeal the global gag rule. We're also advocating for the repeal of the Helms Amendment. For nearly 50 years, this coercive policy has blocked the use of U.S. foreign assistance to expand access to abortion. And it really, continues to push the very extremist ideology of a vocal minority of U.S. politicians on people with low incomes around the world. The great majority of Americans believe that we should have and support access to abortion, and yet our structures have led us to a place where there are so few in power, but they control the levers of power. We have a real opportunity, I think, to collaborate, engage with you much better. And I also think that if you just look at the Biden administration slate, that was Health and Human Services slate that was named earlier this week, they're also really signaling the link between racial justice and public health priorities. We have a COVID equity czar, someone who actually will be thinking about the ways in which this pandemic is impacting, people differently, particularly people of color, people who are our essential workers. And so I know that sexual and reproductive health is inextricably linked to those policy areas, and making sure that our personnel is showing up in the right way and that our policy is as well. Holding us accountable is really the best remedy from our partners and allies.
Minister Gould, that's an excellent question. I think you must have been a journalist in a previous life. And Alexis, thank you so much for those clear views and such a strategy on the way forward of what needs to be done. I would just like to follow up on one point, because you talked about the work that we can do to fight for race equity. Can you talk more about how we can come together as partners in what is absolutely critical work?
Yeah, one of the things that I love about thinking about how we operationalize intersectionality through policy is it really kind of puts a counter to the ways in which we normally do work together. We normally come together through coalition building, right? Which is by definition temporary. It's partners, allies coming together in movements, whether we need to push a policy, a global policy through to meet a shared goal, or to elect a candidate. But then it once we've achieved whatever that mission is, we tend to fall back in our silos. I think when you think about intersectionality and the ways in which we have to essentially carry each other's issues to the fore and center them, it requires us to think about how we sustain and build an infrastructure at the intersection of our movements. Sometimes that means leading, right? That sexual and reproductive health is at the center. And sometimes it means taking a step back and following the leadership across other movements so that we can grow power and move an agenda forward. One of the ways in which Planned Parenthood has been actively thinking about this is how do we use our platform differently, elevating the work of our partners in the reproductive justice movement, who have long made the explicit connection between racial justice and reproductive rights. And so I know sometimes we think about this in terms of cross-movement work, but I also think it applies with our multilateral relationships and, as countries with a keen interest in reducing disparities for women and girls worldwide. We have to think of the multitude of ways in which we interact with each other and engage in ways that are non-transactional, and transformational. So I think it is, again, for us, it's recognizing the fact that the fight for Black lives here and abroad is a fight for reproductive freedom, and it's the right to live free from violence in our states. And so I think that the ways in which we are working together to empower folks around the sets of issues, I think is one of the ways in which I think we can really operationalize both race equity work as well as intersectionality.
Listening to leaders like you, it's just so reinvigorating, and it's so encouraging. We believe that we know what needs to be done, don't we? We just know what needs to be done and what works, but we need the political will to do it. Change is possible. So Alexis and Minister Gould, thank you so much for your insights and for encouraging us and for doing this critical work and for having the political will to achieve it as well, because it's absolutely crucial that we all work together. Thank you so much. Well, speaking about inspiration and role models, we are truly honoured to have this message from Michelle Bachelet, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Now, unfortunately, Michelle was not able to join us today, as it is Human Rights Day, of course. She's a little bit busy, but she recorded this message especially for us.
Greetings, and thank you to the organizer of this important event. The focus of your discussions today could not be more timely. While the reality of multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination has always been a reality, our current circumstances demand that more serious efforts are deployed to understand and address these human rights concerns. In many places around the world, sexual and reproductive health and rights are in constant jeopardy. But for women from marginalized groups, the impact is worse. Across regions, we see adverse maternal health outcomes for Indigenous and minority women, including women of African descent, in both developed and developing countries. We note that those at higher risk of forced sterilization are women experiencing intersecting forms of discrimination: HIV-positive women, women and girls with disabilities, trans people, and Roma women, for instance. Where states place barriers to safe abortion services, whether all-out bans or other obstacles such as mandatory waiting periods, it is women living in poverty and adolescent girls, for example, who are most likely to seek to terminate their pregnancy in unsafe circumstances. If it wasn't already clear before, the COVID pandemic has forced us all to bear witness to the glaringly disparate impact on women from disadvantaged and marginalized groups. When we gloss over these differential impacts, when we pretend that health and other policies inevitably benefits all equally, we're failing in our human rights obligation, and we're failing in our commitment under the 2030 Agenda to leave no one behind. As activists within the reproductive justice movement have taught us, this is not just about health. Understanding the countless ways that discriminatory forces intersect is central also to securing economic and climate justice, resisting ethno-nationalism, and building societies which genuinely embrace the basic principles that all individuals are born free and equal in dignity and rights. We can and we must do better. Ensuring that the voices of women and girls in all their diversity are central in our discussions is critical for credible, legitimate, and effective responses. Recognizing and addressing the ways in which these multiple forms of oppression are baked into our systems and structures is critical groundwork for putting in place more inclusive policies.
Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I think, well, the message is pretty clear there, isn't it? This is not just about health. All individuals are born free and equal in dignity and in rights, and we must and we can do more and we can do better. So we've got to work together. So on that note, let's move to the second part of our programme. We're going to learn more about the experiences and the realities of women and girls' rights and other intersecting forms of discrimination during our conversation with our distinguished panel. So it gives me great pleasure to virtually welcome Dr. Kalpana Apte, Secretary General of the Family Planning Association India. Dr. Kalpana has 23 years of experience as a development professional in public health, particularly sexual and reproductive health and rights and family planning in India. Warm welcome. Also, Maria Lizeth Villegas, a Mexican activist for the rights of women and young Indigenous peoples, originally from the Mayan community of Chinhuhub Quintana Ru, I hope I pronounced that right. Maria addresses chronic violence and promoting equitable gender relations among young people. So welcome to you. And also Pamina Sebastiao, an Angolan activist on gender and sexuality. Pamina has a master's degree in international law and international relations and has dedicated themselves to activism for many years. I'm so thrilled to be able to speak to all of you, and just reminding all of the people joining us, please do get your questions ready because we'll have a Q&A session at the end of this. But first of all, let's start with our first question. And I'd like to talk to you, Maria Lizeth. You are a young woman, you're an Indigenous person. What does this mean for you in your daily life? Have you experienced and live intersectional forms of discrimination? How does your activism address these challenges?
Buenos días a todas y todos. Antes que nada, pues quisiera agradecer la oportunidad que me dan de poder estar en un espacio tan importante como este. Y bueno, para mí ser una mujer indígena significa resistencia y ser joven significa valentía. En primer lugar, porque seguimos la lucha que nuestras ancestras iniciaron. Y en segundo, pues porque estas luchas en nuestro contexto actual se manifiestan de diferentes maneras y por ende hemos tenido que aprender a afrontarlas con más valor. Pero ser una mujer joven indígena también significa vivir una triple dimensión de la discriminación, por ser mujer, por ser indígena, por ser joven, y los bloques aumentarían si vamos sumándonos más características, como el ser parte de la comunidad LGBT, por ejemplo. A lo largo del corto camino de vida que he recorrido, claro que he sentido y vivido esta triple discriminación por el simple hecho de ser lo que soy. Pero creo que la realidad de esta situación va más allá de mi persona, porque también las mujeres que estuvieron antes de mí, es decir, mi abuela y mi madre, también lo vivieron, tuvieron que enfrentar grandes obstáculos, entre ellos el no poder continuar con sus estudios, el vivir violencia y también momentos de pobreza. Ser una mujer indígena es algo distinto a ser una mujer en cualquier otro contexto, porque nuestras cosmovisiones influyen en los mandatos que rigen nuestra dinámica comunitaria, distintos a los mandatos establecidos en otras zonas. Por ejemplo, el hecho de que una mujer joven indígena tome la decisión de estudiar implica enfrentar obstáculos que una mujer joven de otro contexto, como de otra ciudad, en primera porque los obstáculos que una joven que se encuentra en una ciudad no son los mismos a los que enfrenta una mujer joven indígena, porque en nuestras comunidades imperan las prácticas machistas y misóginas que generan que lo único que se espere de las mujeres jóvenes dentro de nuestras comunidades es que contraigan matrimonio y que formen una familia. Y en segunda, porque el acceso a la educación es bastante limitada. Yo he tenido que lidiar con estos obstáculos por haber decidido continuar con mis estudios y me ha ocurrido que dentro de este trayecto de universitaria, por el hecho de ser una mujer joven indígena, se ha puesto en duda mis capacidades para poder permanecer dentro de una universidad, porque vengo de una comunidad rural. He sufrido discriminación por el color de mi piel, pero es precisamente son estas razones las que me han dado las fuerzas suficientes de querer acabar con estas brechas, con estas desigualdades y con estas formas de discriminación. Porque un día me dije a mí misma que si yo no tomaba esa responsabilidad de cambiar este patrón que se ha seguido generación tras generación en las mujeres de mi familia, pues yo nunca iba a lograr alcanzar ese mundo que he soñado. Y por eso hace ya casi 2 años decidí entrar al mundo del activismo. Tomé la responsabilidad, porque yo creo que eso es lo que significa ser activista, tomar una responsabilidad grande para generar cambios sociales en pro de mejores mundos. El activismo que yo he desarrollado estos últimos años ha estado enfocado en la promoción de los derechos sexuales y los derechos reproductivos con y para personas jóvenes, y la difusión de ha considerado también la importancia de la construcción de un plan de vida, sobre todo para mujeres jóvenes indígenas.
Maria, thank you so much. Really inspirational and very moving, actually, just hearing about the challenges and also the work that you do for the Indigenous community. It's just Really, really quite humbling, actually. Thank you for sharing that with us. Let's speak to Dr. Kalpana. Can you please tell us more about the neglected form of discrimination, which is the caste system, and about its specific impact on women and girls' human rights and position in society, and perhaps how this system overlaps with other forms of discrimination that women and girls face, and how it can be that this system and discrimination is still so alive. It's 2020.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hello, Cassia and fellow panelists. This is not really a neglected system, caste-based or segregation of communities based on their caste or ranking of people is very, very old practice in India, and it's very pervasive, ever prevalent. It's just not seen by the global community. Actually, Martin Luther King years ago said that I am an untouchable, if you remember his very famous words when he came to India. And he could see the immediate connect of disempowerment, empowerment, and you could see that he could recognize that immediately. Gender and caste intersectionality really means that women and girls within the lower ranking castes at the lowest end of developmental or at an opportunity level. Really speaking, caste system has been there for thousands of years. India got independence around 70 years ago, and after that there have been laws, very important and powerful laws, which make it illegal to segregate people on basis their caste. There have also been some laws which have been more equity driven, in which we provide more opportunities to people who come from so-called lower ranking castes. However, in practice, and particularly in rural areas, these cultural practices are still very much prevalent. And because of these practices, which are so subtle and so pervasive in nature, you will find, you pick up any data set and you will find that people who are almost very much neglected, or those who are not able to realize their full potential or their sexual and reproductive health rights are the ones who belong to lower ranking castes. Within that, even men and boys and women and girls, if you see the data, it's very, very clear that women and girls are at the lowest rung of this spectrum. And if you see malnutrition, it's about 44% of malnutrition among children below 5 is in scheduled tribes and scheduled caste, those who are recognized as being untouchables or castes which are at the lowest rung of development. So you will find more malnutrition. You will also see data tells us that age at marriage is very low in India. But the lowest or youngest brides would be from scheduled caste and scheduled tribes and denotified tribes in rural areas. So you see that from childhood, this discrimination starts. Their health status parameters is low. Educational, if you see dropouts, in spite of several subsidies, several encouraging practices which are there in law and in practice, it doesn't really reach the most poor. You will see that they are not able to even enjoy what is their right to be going to be able to go to schools and colleges, and 30% to 50% reservations in academic institutions, in jobs, in promotions. But even in spite of this, there are a large chunk of women and girls who are not able to enjoy or utilize these opportunities. And that really is on health, on development, and on all opportunities this impacts. And it's very subtle, and it's all pervasive.
Subtle but all pervasive. It's very much when you put it, the statistics, it's absolutely staggering as well. Dr. Kalpana, thank you so much. Let's turn to Pamina. You're part and co-leader of several collectivities and organizations which are related to gender and sexuality issues, among them the Onjando Feminista and Arquivo Identidade Angolana, apologies for my pronunciation. What made you get involved in them? What are the connections between all of those collectivities, organizations, and causes? And what challenges do you face in breaking down gender and sexuality norms and stereotypes?
Thank you so much for having me, and I was just appreciating all the inspirational speeches and other fellow activists talking about their realities that I don't have that much contact with. So there has been a question that has been navigating through this activism years. That is a question: how do we live the life we want to live? How we start living a life? So we are in this situation where we are surviving, and sometimes we are trying to respond in different ways, either with responding in politics, either responding with different alternatives for our surviving situation. So right now, I think as an intersectionality, we need to start talking about for me, two elements that we need to engage in the feminist movement, which is how we also feed in the gender performativity, and also how we start talking about precariety, precarious life, and try to see how colonialism and coloniality feeds into these two elements. So regarding the precarious life, for example, in sexual reproductive rights, in Angola right now, we have a penal code that was recently published where HIV criminalization and other sexual rights are still very criminalized and reinforce not only HIV transmission, but also HIV exposure and not sharing the HIV status. So this has been a regional fight, how we fight for these laws that's still reinforcing our lack of access to health. And we also in the midst of a conversation on how we can enforce stigma, how we can fight against stigma and discrimination for access to health. Of course, this is a broader conversation for not only women and girls, but also for marginalized groups. And with Django and Arquivo, the idea was how we start engaging about this political term, which is vulnerability, and we start creating answers for the sexual and reproductive rights, either by awareness, either by creating alternative ways where people can have access to their health rights where they didn't have when they went to the health facilities. So with the Arquivo, just to explain, it's a feminist, lesbian, bisexual, and queer group. And Don Django, it's a feminist women's group. So we are still having this division when we should be working in a very much intersect feminist approach. But the work is there. There are very recent movements. We are talking about 5-6 years. The involvement has been very much to create safe spaces for women and girls and marginalized groups, spaces for awareness, spaces where we can discuss what kind of services we need in respect of sexual and reproductive rights. So so sorry.
Don't worry, it's all good.
My challenge with this is how, and I think we're gonna have a moment to talk about how we also question the feminism that we are doing to incorporate these two elements that I'm trying to bring here. How we also question the woman's identity that we discussed in the feminist movement. And also how we question also intersectionality, because identity politics has been not sufficient to give an answer to our differences. So right now, what I have been navigating is how we have a conversation about colonialism, how we have a conversation on how coloniality feeds on our Angolan African colonialism. And how we, when we talk about sexual and reproductive rights, have also a conversation that is already happening in the region, and I think in Global South, about the microeconomies structures, how they work to feed also and limit our sexual and reproductive rights. I don't know if if I still have time, but I'm gonna stop here. Thank you very much.
Pamina, thank you. That was really, really great. And the idea about a safe space is so absolutely crucial. We're going to come back to you shortly, but let's just go to Kalpana now, because I want to pick up on an interview that you gave a while ago now, where you stated that women bear the consequences of having a uterus and that they are at a higher risk of death and disability, yet they don't have choices, they can't make decisions. So how is this reality affecting women, girls, especially those of the so-called lower castes that you were discussing previously? And is there a difference in how the pervasive impact of the caste system affects the lives of women and girls from higher castes?
So biologically, there is a responsibility which comes from having a uterus and being responsible for bearing children or pregnancies. However, we live in such a world where this responsibility does not come with rights, because women seldom, if ever, get to make those choices whether or not they want to be pregnant, whether or not they want to continue that pregnancy, when they want to do what they want to do. And the society and the family and the patriarchy basically makes those decisions for them. And ultimately, it does result in death and disability for many women across the spectrum, I would say. I would say that being a woman actually puts you already in a compromised situation. And if you look at the entitlement is like layers. You peel off a layer and then you see that, okay, there are some who are first amongst equals, and then there are some who are lower down on the spectrum of entitlement. So if we speak within that, if we speak about people, human beings, men, women, transgender, everybody, then we see that, of course, we are not talking about men. They are entitled as compared to women. But if you then compare between the so-called upper ranking caste and lower ranking caste, you see that these women from upper ranking caste are more entitled, slightly better than the women and girls from the lower ranking caste. And I will tell you, my experience has been, whenever I go for self-help group meetings, typically, classically, or if I go to the village level meetings or I meet a group of women, typically the more the ones who speak more vocal would be the women and girls from upper castes, and typically they would be girls coming in from the lower ranking caste or from the tribal groups would be the ones who are on the fringes of the group and behind, and they won't have the courage or the opportunity to speak and express themselves. So it's as simple as that. And therefore, I would say that entitlement, even amongst women, that of belonging to upper caste would be slightly better, and significant would be the gender-based violence. I would say that there are more incidents involving women and girls of lower ranking caste, and sexual violence and group violence, I would say gang rapes and so on, more are reported among girls from Dalit communities and tribal girls as compared to women and girls belonging to upper caste. Not that they don't face these, but then definitely the incidence is lower as compared to the lower caste girls and women. Now, we can argue that this is a reporting error, or there are more reports or less reports, and this being politicized. The fact of the matter, that the safety and opportunity for girls belonging to lower castes is much less. They are much more disempowered. They are much more earlier married, and they don't have that kind of choice. If you see continuation of contraception, if you see providers bias, they face it all as compared to those who are belonging to upper caste. So I would say that yes, women and girls belonging to upper caste, but poorer sections, and then separated widows, living alone, single households, any castes are more vulnerable, but amongst all of them, really the face of poverty, if you were to say, which is disempowerment and disentitlement, would be of girls and women belonging to the lower ranking castes in India and in rural areas. In urban areas, in slums, it is now slowly fading, but you will find this much more pervasive in rural areas. So I'll stop.
Yeah, I think I'm in accord with you. I'm in agreement with you, and that idea of entitlement as being layers, it's really interesting. It's definitely one that is a really good way to describe it. Thank you, Kalpana. Let's go back to Pamina, because Pamina, throughout the years there have been different waves of feminism, and also different areas of focus, from property rights and the right to vote, to equality and anti-discrimination, reproductive justice. It seems that there's not one definition of feminism. So what does it mean to be a feminist today for you? How do you perceive feminism within, let's say, these expanding spheres of identities?
Oh, there's such a... I'm going through this moment where I'm questioning the how of feminism. Remember when I was explaining that I'm trying to figure out how we have a conversation on how coloniality, especially gender coloniality, feeds on our colonialism. So I'm trying to figure out also, because many years of activism make you realize how we have, I think we're going to be talking about this, how we also have such a pressure for a very specific agenda that doesn't allow us as collective to invest in ourselves to create a real movement. We can discuss and critique the idea of development. We can discuss the idea of NEOization in African countries, and also the idea of NEOization for collectives, which is donors supporting for very specific areas, but not creating the time for us to grow as collectives. We have a very an activism based on a very in volunteer way, especially the LGBTIQ activism and the feminist activism also. Like I said, it's a very recent one. I have been navigating in 3 forms of feminism today, which is the ecofeminist, because of this understanding of coloniality of nature, the exploration of nature, and how we can also have a discussion about this for the environment and the response we need to for the next years and generations. So active feminist has been feeding me in that sense. The colonial feminists, Latin America, we have very strong the colonial feminists that has been, that they wrote and has been engaging in a very continuous critique on gender and coloniality, and also post-colonial feminism, which is the idea that we need, again, like what I was trying to say, we need to question this gender performativity. We need to question the gender besides the binary, and especially in Africa, we need to question the gender as a colonial element, as a colonial idea. So these are the kind of 3 feminists that I have been navigating on how to shift the idea of how to have a more feminist lens that work for us in Angola. So there's not
a more feminist. That's a big concept. That's great.
So there's not for me right now, there's not only specific families that gives a response on how we navigate the violence and stigma and discrimination that we face on a daily basis, and the lack of access to very basic services, and the need of structures that respond to our needs. So what I have been trying to understand, it's what are the elements. I was talking about the macroeconomy idea of understanding, because a lot of families are having this conversation right now, and how we can understand this to understand how our economic politics are right now. And this also goes to understanding how this is connected to the African death. You know, we are right now having a lot of conversation about the African death, where we are, and what this means for our precarious lives, what this means for the next generations regarding the sexual reproductive rights, what this means when we trying to question politics, public politics. We need to connect this economic and this vision of macroeconomy also into this discussion. It's something that I have been learning recently. It wasn't part of my experience as activist. It started becoming part of it when I really started realizing the having more contact with the colonial families. Because when you understand the idea of coloniality, you start understanding how the patriarchal, heteropatriarchal, racist, capitalist structure of power works. And I'm going to be really stating, because we talk about patriarchy here, but we always forget to talk about the hetero-cis patriarchy, because this is important also when we are trying to question. It's not only the patriarchy itself, it's also this system of sexual politics that was created for a very specific body. Engaging with this three forms of families is, and also putting that element of understanding the microeconomics is where I'm at right now. So it's a question, and it goes back to the first question I did. How do we live a life that we want to live and get out of surviving?
It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Pamina. That's been there's so much to think about that. Gender as a colonial idea and all these different, bringing the economy into it. Of course, it's just been absolutely really fascinating. You've opened up our minds so much. Let's go to Maria Lizeth now. And Maria, we think about patriarchal norms, and that machismo mindset is quite often at the root cause of sexual and gender-based violence. What societal factors have contributed to maintain such mindsets? As a young advocate active in this particular area, what needs to change, and what is your generation hoping? How is it coping with this?
Yo creo que uno de los factores que condiciona estas prácticas son las normas sociales que las instituciones sociales construyen como esquemas reguladores de lo que se debe de pensar, de lo que se debe de creer y hacer. Con instituciones sociales me refiero a la iglesia, a la familia, a los medios de comunicación, a la escuela, etc. Es decir, estos grupos de referencia que tienen el poder de dictar reglas y que reproducen el sistema patriarcal. Pero creo que lo que hay que resaltar en esto es el papel que juegan los varones y el mandato de su masculinidad hegemónica, la cual perpetúa diversos tipos de violencia, no solo hacia las mujeres, sino también hacia ellos mismos. Lo que debemos cambiar es precisamente esto. Pero bueno, esto ya es una tarea que compete más a ellos, a los varones. Ellos deben de comprometerse a deconstruir su masculinidad y a trabajar más en las nuevas masculinidades, las cuales rompen con este pacto patriarcal y trabajan contra la violencia basada en género. Y pues claro que la normalización de la cultura machista es algo realmente difícil de combatir. Sin embargo, pues creo que en la actualidad tanto los movimientos feministas y estos nuevos grupos de hombres que trabajan las masculinidades positivas están haciendo grandes aportaciones para cambiar y transformar las normas sociales de género. Por ejemplo, en mi comunidad hay un colectivo juvenil que promueve las masculinidades positivas con este enfoque rural, en un contexto rural. Y pues otra de las acciones que creo que también puede dar gran contribución para cambiar esta mentalidad machista y patriarcal es empoderando a las mujeres y a las niñas. Y bueno, creo que a comparación de los esfuerzos anteriores, en esta generación está cada vez más presente y latente que las personas jóvenes desde sus diversidades participen y sean más conscientes de todas las problemáticas sociales que enfrentamos. Somos una generación que cuestiona de forma más crítica el sistema ya establecido. Nosotros estamos haciendo reflexiones más profundas sobre lo que ocurre a nuestro alrededor y, por ejemplo, la pandemia de COVID-19 que todavía seguimos enfrentando, no detuvo esta lucha, al contrario, nos hizo darnos cuenta de que somos capaces de adaptarnos a las situaciones difíciles y seguir llevando a cabo acciones ahora ya a través de los medios digitales que contribuyen a la erradicación de la violencia basada en género.
Maria, thank you so much. And really interesting to talk about the role of men, because ultimately, yeah, as you say, perpetuate violence towards themselves. It's crucial to have men in the conversation as well when it comes to this. Thank you. Let's go back to Kalpana. You've been a leader on advancing sexual and health and reproductive rights. Can you share your thoughts on how to create an enabling environment for social progress in these aspects of our lives?
These barriers and these cultural practices are long ingrained in the psyche of communities. And therefore, we will have to start, and we have actually FP India. I wish I could show you a picture of a young girl coming from a so-called lower ranking caste who is our champion today. And we have such champions across our country in most of our field areas where we work with young people. So I think it's extremely important that we work with young people because they are the hope and they have the energy and the willingness and the aspiration to change. It's extremely important to create an enabling environment and work with the larger communities. And this is where we will need to understand and have a discourse that the subtle understanding which no one questions, that somewhere some people, women, girls, are lesser of human beings. They're not full human beings, as it were. They're not worthy of everything that is entitled to everybody else. And I think that discourse and the resultant ill health, the resultant violence, the resultant violations, and the resultant, you can say, lack of development, this all needs to be laid out with the families, with the individuals, and we need to ensure that individuals remain at the center of development. Women and girls are able to access everything that they need to access, and we need to create champions. All of this cannot be done in 2 years or 4 years of funded interventions that typically come these days. These are long-term investments where we have to work with communities and we have to see that generations come up. Young people lead the change and we just facilitate that change. And I will tell you that it pays off and it has paid off. I've been in the sector for about 25, 30 years and I have seen generations of young people, powerful speakers and champions who have changed the face of their own community. And I could take you to Agra or in Uttar Pradesh, many districts where we work, or in other places where there's winds of change are. But we need to invest, we need to have perseverance, and we need to have long-term investment goals. And that's only it will work. It will not work just for 2 or 3 years and we do some IEC activities and we do some health camps. It won't work. It will not work. Any amount of policy is not going. We need to work with the communities and young people and create that kind of understanding. A long-term goal is what I would say.
Thank you so much. And yeah, it needs long-term policies. Thank you. We don't have much time left, so I'm going to ask our esteemed guests just to keep their answers brief. So Maria, asking you to keep your answer brief, but if you could tell me that about Latin America, of course, remains the most economically unequal region in the world, but it also has the high rates of inequality due to factors beyond a person's control, things like race, gender, place of birth, family background. How do you break this cycle of inequality and pervasive discrimination, especially for the Indigenous women and community as a whole? Briefly, please.
Bueno, evidentemente toda la región de América Latina, pues que cuenta con innumerables pueblos indígenas, sufre en distinto grado las formas de discriminación y desigualdad, pero creo que es importante enfatizar que parte de esto se debe a la deuda histórica que los estados tienen con los pueblos indígenas, una deuda que todavía no ha logrado ser pagada. Es decir, por muchísimos años ha habido un total desatendimiento hacia las necesidades de los pueblos y las comunidades indígenas. Y yo creo firmemente que una de las formas para acabar con todo este ciclo de desigualdades y de discriminación es primero considerar a las mujeres y a las niñas indígenas como sujetas de derecho. Y lo segundo, dando aperturas a mesas de diálogos, escuchar de las propias voces de las personas indígenas las necesidades y las problemáticas que enfrentan en su día a día, para así posteriormente poder crear e implementar políticas bien diseñadas que cuenten con una perspectiva de género, con una perspectiva intercultural y con un enfoque interseccional. El escuchar las necesidades particulares de las personas indígenas generaría el no ir implementar políticas públicas con esta perspectiva eurocentrista y colonial, una situación que ha ocurrido muchas veces. Y bueno, la propuesta es hacer primero consultas, dialogar con las propias mujeres indígenas, para así hacer que estas políticas públicas que puedan ser implementadas lleguen a donde tienen que llegar y que lleguen bien. Las soluciones de las problemáticas de los pueblos indígenas tienen que salir desde los pueblos indígenas, los estados, las organizaciones internacionales, las organizaciones civiles, etcétera. Únicamente deben de fungir como este puente que permita que las comunidades puedan salir por sí mismas de estas problemáticas que enfrentan. Y también creo que una de las herramientas más importantes y que siempre debe de ser considerado es el garantizar un acceso a la educación de calidad a las personas de los pueblos indígenas, pensando en la niñez, pensando en las juventudes, porque la educación es una de las herramientas que podría generar grandes contribuciones para la eliminación de todas las formas de discriminación y desigualdades. Y también creo que el incentivar que mujeres indígenas formen parte de procesos como este, en donde están tomadoras y tomadores de decisiones, es importante, porque aunque la participación de las mujeres indígenas está presente, todavía es necesario seguir llegando a más espacios como este, en donde podamos poner sobre la mesa de discusión las problemáticas y las necesidades que enfrentamos en nuestras vidas. Nosotras hacemos todo por estar, pero a veces resulta ser muy complejo. Por ejemplo, el idioma, el hecho de no saber inglés, pues también resulta ser una brecha de comunicación. Sin embargo, pues aquí seguimos y estamos en pie de lucha.
And we're listening, and we are listening, Maria. Thank you so much, Maria Lizeth. And Pamina, in your bio, you state that you are dismounting yourself in a new project, which is centered in deconstructing, you'll have to tell me, the body as a conversation about coloniality of power, allowing new ways to speak outside of the standardized and colonial activism. Is it possible to share with us some thoughts about this process? Can you break it up for us and explain why it's important, but briefly as well? There's a challenge.
Okay. Yes, and thank you so much, Maria, for that, because we need to work and empower ourselves, communities, and this also work as also understanding that a body it's a mean, and my work is a little bit about that. How it's about how many things were inscripted in my own body, and how this put me in a place of precarious life, of surviving in a daily basis, and also in this such vulnerability that if we don't understand what are these elements that were inscripted, we are not going to be able to make the path to start breaking down those elements. So Sobelu, which means just beautiful, it's my first ever. I didn't know I could do art, honestly, and art saves us. In the midst of activism, I think sometimes art saves us. Art and therapy, honestly. But it was, I couldn't know, I always believe art is part of the activism, but I didn't know I had so much to say. And I think there's an author in Brazil, Conceição Evaristo, she has term which is escrevivência, which is writing about my own living, you know. And part of the question that I'm keep asking about how we then live outside of surviving, it's also possible when we by ourselves define what is living. And what I'm trying to do with this project is it's trying to navigate everything that was inscripted and going back to me and defining how it's living, while questioning all these elements, either gender, race, all the elements about the structure, heteropatriarchal, cis, racist, capitalist structure. And in this conversation, having time, it's the essence. Because a lot of the things when we talk about empowerment, we forget that we need time to empower people. And sometimes the way donors support, it's a very specific time frame that it doesn't allow collectives to become collectives. It doesn't allow collectives to become movements. So we need more time. This, by defining living, we start appreciating what time means, because capitalism kind of stole that also from us. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
You know what, Pamina, it's so poignant and so perfect that you finished talking about the concept of time. And as anybody knows, there are not enough hours in the day, and we are out of time. Thank you so, so much, Pamina, Maria Lizeth, and Dr. Kalpana. You have been phenomenal. We have had so many questions that we're going to follow up all of the fantastic questions from our brilliant, brilliant viewers. Honestly, the questions have been so great. We're going to get those questions answered by our terrific panel in a follow-up session. So in follow-up notes, so please do just look out for that. We will get back in touch with you because the questions have been flooding in, but we are out of time. Yes, capitalism does take time away from us. Thank you, guests, so, so much. Well, now it is my distinct privilege to introduce someone I have long admired for her work and unequivocal stance on the side of universal human rights and SRHR for all people everywhere. Kate Gilmore has been a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, is at the Harvard Kennedy School, and is the chair of IPPF's Board of Trustees. A phenomenal person. Please join me in very, very warmly welcoming for the closing remarks, Kate Gilmore.
Thank you so much for that beautiful and undeserved introduction. But, you know, on behalf of International Planned Parenthood Federation, may I extend our warmest thanks to our wonderful partners behind this remarkable event, including the governments of Tunisia and Canada. But warm thanks to our inspiring speakers and to absolutely everyone who's joined us today, including our wonderful moderator. Thank you for combining to create this generous and wise exchange. Thank you for recalling for us all that the full realization of these most intimate of human rights requires a deep appreciation too, that the specific identities we own and those that are imposed upon us are inexorably intertwined with our dignity, our fundamental human rights, indivisible and inalienable. Thank you for urging us to recall further that when those identities, under forces of hate and exclusion or neglect, are stratified into hierarchies determinative of our access to information, to services, to safety, to justice, or to voice, there follows from there only indignity, injustice, and ultimately inhumanity. Excellencies, friends, under international human rights legal standards and norms, those who have the power to dismantle those pernicious barriers are obliged to do just that. In other words, we must hold accountable our governments and their health and education authorities when, by reason of discrimination on grounds such as age, race, gender, sexuality, disability, they fail to uphold their duties. Sexual and reproductive health and rights, after all, are not just matters of state sovereignty, party manifesto, or political preference, but nor are they merely questions of balancing competing public health priorities. They are rights, and those rights require that life-saving essential services be universally, inclusively, affordably, and consistently available. No exclusions, no exceptions, no excuses, not even, it must now be said, in pandemic times. And yet, today, there are leaders of countries small and large, north and south, who, for reasons of self-interested political gain, are not dismantling neo-colonialist walls of exclusion, but are building them up, inciting fear-fueled, hate-driven, nativist, populist campaigns against sexual and reproductive health and rights, campaigns rooted in racist, homophobic, misogynist Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, xenophobia. Well, may we call for these rights to be at the center of the Sustainable Development Agenda, but it is they who have made sexual and reproductive health and rights a mainstream target, manufacturing false contests between women's rights and the future of the family, inciting white supremacist imaginaries through racism, asserting ideals of masculinity toxic to all women and girls and for any man, boy, or transgender person who will not join in, and seeking to wash their hands of responsibility for the preventable harm, injury, and death they cause with the would-be sanitizers of religion and faith distorted. The global gag rule is but the highest profile example, but by no means the only one. And although, as we've heard, we hope a change in US administration may mean at least a temporary, ideally a permanent change in that heinous policy, the underlying reasons for its existence will not simply slip away with its repeal. Sexual and reproductive health and rights by today's geopolitics is made a deep borderline in humanity's cruel segregations. In this, people are not merely left behind at random, but by prejudice, bigotry, and discrimination. They are deliberately, selectively being locked out of human dignity in order that others of us may be falsely promised gated communities for relative privilege. Friends, on this International Human Rights Day, remembering the many authors who across the world, in cultures the world over and down the centuries, gifted to us the ideals that today we call universal human rights, perhaps I might just reference one. Benjamin Franklin, of all people, who alone is signatory to all 4 documents establishing the US, famously made the point, as pertinent today as are the best of his ideals, that justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. Thank you for reminding us today on World Human Rights Day that for the sake of sexual and reproductive justice, those of us who, by virtue of our privilege, are relatively less affected still have a hell of a long way to go before we are nearly outraged enough. I thank you.
Kate Gilmore, we thank you. Absolutely inspirational. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the message is clear. We need to break the norms and construct our societies free from discrimination, stigma, and bigotry, so as to ensure that gender equality and the human rights of women and girls, of adolescents and youth, and their fundamental freedoms, as well as sexual and reproductive health and rights, are all realised. Thank you once again to the governments of Canada, Tunisia, and of course the International Planned Parenthood Federation for making this event possible. Before we depart, I invite each and every one of you in whatever capacity to help make these fundamental human rights and freedoms a reality for everyone, wherever they live, whoever they are. Thank you so much.